So, welcome to the Carlton Academy's Year 9 lesson on Manchuria. As we mentioned before, this is a really important lesson, so it's really important that you complete all the tasks on here and message your teacher on Teams if you have any questions at all. So, let's make a start on the lesson now. Remember, I'll tell you where to pause to complete the activities and I'll go through them afterwards as well. The first task you're going to need to complete is a spider diagram of the impact of the Great Depression on the 6 countries that you can see listed on here. Now, you might not want to put all the headings on straight away because you don't know how much information you're going to need to write about, so you don't know the space yet, but I'm going to talk through it all on the next slide. The idea behind this spider diagram is it gives you the background to the events of the 1930s. Now, the League hadn't been perfect in the 1920s, but it had been doing pretty well with certain countries and dealing with small-scale problems like the island islands between Sweden and Finland. In the 1930s, they deal with 2 problems so badly that it causes the collapse of the League, and that's to do with some events that involved both Japan and Italy. So we're going to look now at the background to why the League collapsed and the impact of the Great Depression. I'm going to talk you through each of the 6 countries and the information you'll need to write down over the next few slides. So you might want to pause it here quickly just to put impact of the Great Depression in the centre of your page. Remember, you need lots of room to be able to write about those 6 countries around it. I'll talk you through each of the areas that you need to know about and the information for your spider diagram. Now, the first country that you want to put on your spider diagram is Britain. And we don't need to know loads of detail about how Britain was affected by the Great Depression, but we do need to know that Britain suffered from high unemployment and was not willing to get involved with sorting out international disputes whilst their own economy was suffering. We're going to see this as a bit of a common theme for all of the countries. But remember that Britain and France are supposed to be the main leaders of the League. They're supposed to be the ones that are putting international cooperation above all else. And we can already see that they're more self-interested at this point and they're worried about their own unemployment rate. So you might want to just pause it now and just quickly write down some notes there about Britain that you can see in that box. Okay. Once you've done that and you've written about Britain, you also then want to write about Germany and how Germany was affected. Now, Germany was really badly affected because of those Dawes plans that you made notes on before, where Germany had received an 800 million mark loan from America, and America then pulled all that money back when the Great Depression hit. As a result, in Germany, 6 million people became unemployed. And the people were so badly affected and so desperate that they voted for the Nazis and Hitler, because Hitler promised to solve all of their problems and give them work and bread. Hitler and the Nazis also said that they were going to overturn the Treaty of Versailles. Now remember, the League of Nations had really 5 main aims, which we remember by the side and then the U. Remember, the U stood for to uphold the Treaty of Versailles. So we know this is going to cause future problems for the League, and the Great Depression is responsible for the Nazis in Germany. So pause it here and make some notes then about the impact of the Great Depression on Germany. Moving on to the third country you need to know about is Japan. Now, this is the really key bit because this is the background for the rest of today's lesson, thinking about how Japan was affected by the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression had a worldwide impact and it threatened a complete collapse of the country's industry, especially because the Japanese industry was really reliant on the export of things like silk. So they used to produce lots of silk and then go and sell it to other countries. However, obviously during the Great Depression, people aren't buying luxury items like silk if they're very scared of losing their jobs and potentially losing their homes, and therefore the Japanese economy was hit really badly. It then led to the invasion of somewhere called Manchuria that was part of China, because it would mean that by invading they were able to make some money. They'd be able to take things like their raw materials from that land and they'd be able to sell them and make quite a lot of profit. So the Great Depression caused Japan to act quite aggressively and to go and invade other places like Manchuria. Remember, this is a really big problem because there are 4 leading powers of the League: Britain, France, Italy and Japan. And this is one of those key countries going against the principles of the League and invading somewhere else. So pause it here quickly to make some notes on Japan, which we can see on the slide. going to look at Italy and how Italy was affected by the Great Depression. So in terms of Italy, it's quite similar. It causes them to act aggressively. And as we're going to see in a few lessons' time, they invade somewhere called Abyssinia. Now, in Italy, economic problems encouraged their leader, a man called Mussolini, to try and build an overseas empire to distract the people's attention away from the domestic difficulties the government faced. Essentially, people often criticise the government when there's economic problems, and Mussolini thought if he could rebuild this big, old, grand Roman Empire, he could distract them and give them something to be proud of rather than criticising the government. So that's what he does. So I'd like you to try and pause it again and again make a few notes about how Italy was affected. So the final two sections that we've got to know about are about the USA and France. So in terms of the USA, we know that they never actually joined the League, they had never been fully supportive of it, and they had become quite isolationist. But during the Great Depression, which affects them incredibly badly, they became even less willing to support the economic trade sanctions when its own trade was such a mess. So we're going to see in some of the crises, they actually make things worse by trading with countries that they shouldn't have been. So that's what we need to know for the USA. Pause it here and make those brief notes on it. And the final area we need to know about is France. Again, remember that France is one of the leading countries of the League, but they became really worried about what was going on in Germany. They know about Hitler and the Nazis being elected. They know that they want to try and destroy the Treaty of Versailles. So instead of trying to worry about international cooperation, they spent their limited money on a series of frontier defences on the border that they shared with Germany. So they worried about their own defences above all else. So again, just pause it and make a couple of notes there about France. Now, the final thing I want you to add somewhere on that page that you've done your spider diagram is the key point that ties it all together. And that is that the Great Depression made countries prioritise their own interests over international ones. People essentially become quite selfish and they want to defend their own economies, which is understandable, but it's not very good for the future of the League. So when countries act aggressively, they're really not comfortable with putting in place economic sanctions, and instead they use weaker things like the moral sanctions, as we're going to see with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So just add that somewhere, and then you've done on that first page on your spider diagram. Well done. We've now completed the first bit, the background to the event. Now we're going to move on to thinking about the actual Manchurian crisis and what happened. So I'd like you to put a new title in your books down on your next page, where I'd like to put how did the Manchurian crisis lead to the failure of the League. Make sure you're using capital letters there because we've got lots of names of an event and also an organisation. So just to give you a bit of the background to it then, we can see where Manchuria is on this map. Now, Japan invaded Manchuria in September 1931, as you already know, because of the impact of the Great Depression. This was one of the two key events that led to the complete collapse of the League, this along with another invasion called the Abyssinian invasion that we'll look at in the future. What I'm going to ask you to do today, because it's the easiest thing that we can get you to do at home for online learning, is to create a fact file about the events of Manchuria. So you're going to end up with a subheading with notes on the causes of it, the events and what happened, and also then the consequences and significance of that event. And essentially, these notes are going to be something that you're going to revise a lot. They are going to be really important. This topic has basically come up in every single GCSE exam for the last 15 years. So it's absolutely crucial that your notes on this are good. And obviously, we're going to be there for you on Teams if you've got any questions, and we will go through everything when we're back together as well. Okay, so just make sure you've got that title down, and then you'll be able to start the rest of the work. So first of all, you're going to be looking at the causes of the Japanese invasion. So we're just going to talk through this information first, and then once I've gone through it all, you can then pause the video and then make your own notes underneath the subheading of causes of the invasion. Now, the Japanese actually controlled the Manchurian railways, even though they weren't actually part of their own country. They still controlled them, they still owned them. And in September 1931, a dramatic event happened where part of the railways were destroyed by an explosion near the town of Mukden. The Japanese then blamed the explosion on the Chinese and used that as their justification for invading Manchuria. They said it was this terrible terrorist organisation that had done this, blown up their railway, and therefore that was their excuse. But the reality is that the explosion that they said was so dramatic is actually so small that other trains are able to pass through on those tracks before they are even fixed. So it's not this big dramatic thing that they said, it was more of an excuse. So we can see here on the second bullet point that in fact the Japanese had planned to invade Manchuria for a long time. They wanted to do it for lots of reasons that we can see outlined here. First of all, the Great Depression. We already know that had a massive impact on Japan. It almost completely crumbled their whole economy because they were so dependent on things like exporting their goods such as silk. That's what their economy was built on. And now that they can't sell those goods, they need to make some money somewhere. And they decide that invading Manchuria could give them lots of much needed raw materials. The second reason why they actually wanted to invade Manchuria as well is because the Japanese population was growing in size. They needed more living space and food, and they thought they should be able to expand into other territory to be able to get that. And the third reason is that the Japanese army and their generals were very powerful, and its generals wanted to expand the Japanese empire by force, and they felt that this was a good excuse to do so. So there was an explosion, but actually it was something that was very small, and it's argued that there might have been a role of the Japanese themselves in this rather than being the Chinese that they claimed it was. So pause it here for me and make some notes on those causes of the Japanese invasion. So now we're moving on to the events of the Japanese invasion. Now what I'd like you to do is put that subheading of the events, and then you need to make some kind of notes. It could be a flow diagram or a timeline or something of the information that we've got below. I'm going to talk through it all, and then you can pause it afterwards and you can make your own shortened notes on this information. Now this event begins in September 1931, and this is when the Japanese blamed the Chinese for that sabotage on the Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway. They then invaded Manchuria and set up the Japanese-controlled state of Manchukuo. This broke the covenant of the League, the rules of the League. Remember, we know them by that side. The first one was about stopping aggression or stopping war, and the Ian side was about encouraging cooperation. And obviously this is very much going against those rules. So later on in October 1931, China appealed to the League for help. Remember, this is what the League was supposed to be built for, helping countries that needed it deal with aggressive nations. Now, the League is incredibly slow. We know that from its organisation. We know that the council was slow. We know that the assembly was slow. And we can see it in action here. Now, in December 1931, a few months after this crisis began, the League sends a man, and the rest of it is a commission, a man and his commission, Lord Lytton, to go and investigate. Now, he doesn't even get to Manchuria to go and investigate this explosion until April 1932, and he doesn't write a report on what actually happened until October 1932, a whole 13 months after the initial invasion. Now, meanwhile, in the time that all of this is going on, the Japanese are attacking and conquering more of China. They've taken over places like Shanghai. The League tries to get involved and says in the meantime there should be a ceasefire, and the Chinese accept that and say, yeah, okay, we'll stop fighting, but the Japanese did not. So things are still going south for China. Things are still really bad, and the League isn't really doing anything apart from sending a man and a commission to go and investigate. Now, in October 1932, 13 months after the initial invasion, Lytton's report states that Japan was the aggressor and they should leave China. So he's saying they were in the wrong and therefore they have to leave. It still then takes another few months for the assembly of the League, remember it's like a world parliament, for them to meet, and when they all meet, they vote that Japan should return Manchuria to the Chinese. Rather than listening, Japan just walk out of the meeting. The league then tries to think about what else they're going to do. They've given them a moral sanction, but what are they going to do now? Are they going to step it up and go to an economic sanction, or step it up even further and go to a military sanction? But they can't agree, especially because the Great Depression has hit them so badly at this point. They're not willing to put in place economic sanctions that would harm themselves as well. So instead they do nothing. And meanwhile, Japan just leaves the league. Even though it was one of the 4 main permanent members, it leaves the league, there's no consequences for them, and they carry on invading China. So this is a really crucial event that absolutely destroys the reputation, the credibility of the league. They've, had to deal with a major international problem here, and they've basically done nothing. They've given a moral sanction, but they're not willing to go any further than that in the midst of the Great Depression. So I'd like you to pause the video here and make some notes. You don't have to write down every word that's on here, but you do need some details about what happened. Now the next section is about why did the League not act? You don't actually have to make any notes on this. This is just to give you a little bit more context, a bit more understanding, but you're more than welcome to if you want to. So we mentioned about the fact that they gave them a moral sanction. I always try and remember this with thinking about the M for Manchuria and the M for moral, so you can remember what type of sanction that they used. Now, they could have gone further. After the moral sanction didn't work, they could have then developed it into an economic or military sanction. Now, they did actually discuss the economic sanctions, but at this point, with that reduction in world trade, with the fact that everybody had been hit so badly by the Great Depression, most people didn't want to do this. In addition, without the USA as a member of the League, it would have actually been impossible to enforce a total block on Japanese imports and exports, so people believed it wasn't really worth it if you didn't have the main trading nation that was also backing you. Furthermore, they didn't want to use military sanctions because Britain and France in particular had no desire to commit their forces to a war so far from Europe. To put it quite simply, they didn't really care what was going on that other side of the world. They felt it was too far away. It didn't actually threaten their empires at all, and therefore they didn't really care very much about it. Both countries were also facing economic difficulties, and trying to go to war against Japan would have been very expensive at a time when they didn't really have any money. They were also worried about their colonies far away, and if they upset Japan, would they then attack colonies in the British Empire? So they decided not to act for those reasons. Now, you don't have to make notes on this, but you will on the next section, which is the final one for note making today, on the significance, the consequences of the event. So the final section of note-making is about the significance of the event and its impact. Now, this is the really key bit. It's going to take you from a grade 4 or 5 to actually taking you to those top grades of those 7s, 8s and 9s. So in order to get those grades, you have to think about the impact of events. So let's go through some points now. So first of all, this is the first major challenge to the League in the 1930s. They were going to be judged on how they handled this, especially as Japan had been one of the 4 permanent members of the League. The betrayal of that is enormous. For them not only to not support the League, but to go against everything it stands for by invading another nation is a real blow to the League from which it can't really recover. Not only is the fact that Japan betrayed them important here, but the fact that the League is so slow is absolutely crucial. We've seen that they're slow before, especially as the Assembly, they all have to make decisions unanimously in order to get anything done. But when we're thinking about this particular crisis, deciding to send Lord Lytton to go and investigate took months, and then it took him even more months to then write a report. It takes 13 months for that report to be produced condemning Japan's actions, which shows that they're slow. And not only are they slow, but they don't follow through with any real conviction or rigour afterwards. And they only use the moral sanctions because they said it was too far away to deal with. This was then ignored by Japan, who left the League in February 1933. It shows that they're powerless. It shows that they're ineffective. If Japan can just leave afterwards with no consequences, it sends a real sign to the rest of the world that the League isn't going to stand up for its beliefs. And it encourages are the leaders to be aggressive, as they can see that the League is weak. And we're going to see that it leads to, in 1935, Mussolini, the leader of Italy, invading another innocent nation, an event which is the final blow to the League of Nations. So I'd like you to pause it here and make some notes on the significance and the consequences of this invasion of Manchuria. Well done for getting to the end of the lesson on Manchuria. I've just put a link at the bottom of the YouTube description. This should also be on Show My Homework as well, where it gives you a link to a documentary that's about 7 minutes long, so it's not very long at all, that will give you even greater clarity if you need it on what happened in Manchuria. It might make it a little bit more memorable for you as well, so it's definitely worth a look if you want to. Now, if you haven't managed to get all of this stuff done in the lesson, please do it before the next lesson as just a brief quick homework, because this is a really crucial event that you do need to know about, and next lesson we'll need to move on to another one. Okay, really well done for listening. Please do ask your teachers if you've got any more questions, and we'll happily get back to you.